September 15, 1916. Flanders-Courcelette, Somme battlefield, France. German machine gunner Unteroffizier Wilhelm Schmidt watched through the morning mist as something emerged from the British lines. Something impossible. A massive metal monster 30 feet long, 8 feet tall, crawling across no man's land on tracks like a farm tractor. Bullets bounced off its armored hull with sparks and metallic pings. It crushed barbed wire beneath it like straw, flattening coils of wire that had taken weeks to emplace. The machine gun that had held this position for weeks, that had killed hundreds of advancing British soldiers, that had turned back a dozen attacks, was suddenly completely useless. Schmidt and his crew abandoned their position and ran, leaving their MG-08 machine gun behind, stumbling through communication trenches toward the rear. Behind them, the steel monster. The British called it a tank, a deliberate code name to disguise its purpose during development, rolled over their trench, crushing the parapet, pivoting on its tracks with mechanical precision, and continued forward toward the German second line. Inside, 8 British soldiers operated the machine in 140-degree heat, choking on carbon monoxide fumes from the engine, deafened by the roar of the 105-horsepower Daimler engine, unable to communicate except by hand signals, but triumphant. They were making history. They were breaking the 3-year stalemate of trench warfare. They were winning the war, except they weren't. Not even close. Of the 49 tanks that attacked that morning across a 10-mile front, only 9 made it past the German front line to achieve their objectives. By the end of the day, 19 were stuck in mud, craters or ditches, victims of terrain the Mark I tank was barely capable of crossing. Another 17 had broken down mechanically. Gearboxes failed, tracks threw off, engines overheated and seized. 5 were destroyed by German artillery that, once the initial shock wore off, found the slow-moving tanks easy targets. The ones that did advance terrified German defenders, captured objectives, and saved British infantry casualties. But they were too few, too slow, too unreliable, and too poorly coordinated to achieve the breakthrough victory their advocates had promised. What happened at Flanders-Courcelette would define the next 25 years of military thinking and lead directly to World War II's opening campaigns and the shape of armored warfare for generations. But not in the way anyone at British General Headquarters expected. The British, who invented the tank and used it first in combat, would learn all the wrong lessons from their invention. The Germans, who were defeated by it and forbidden by treaty from possessing it, would learn the right ones. By 1940, German panzer divisions would smash through France in 6 weeks using tactics that British theorists had pioneered, but the British Army had abandoned. The British, meanwhile, would scatter their superior tanks across the battlefield in small packets attached to infantry formations, using them exactly wrong. The nation that invented armored warfare would be defeated by it, while the nation that initially rejected and was banned from developing it would perfect it and nearly conquer all of Europe. The story of how this happened, how the British invented the tank, developed the theory of mobile armored warfare, then misunderstood its revolutionary purpose, and inadvertently taught their future enemies how to use it properly, is one of military history's greatest and most consequential ironies, and it begins in the mud and blood of the Somme offensive. The tank was born from desperate necessity and innovative thinking colliding in 1915. By that year, the Western Front had calcified into a 450-mile-long stalemate stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Barbed wire, magazine-fed machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute, and quick-firing artillery had made offensive operations suicidal. Attackers had to cross hundreds of yards of open ground swept by interlocking machine gun fire, cut through multiple belts of barbed wire under fire, then assault fortified trenches defended by soldiers with rifles, grenades and more machine guns. The results were catastrophic. The Battle of the Somme, begun in July 1916, had cost 57,000 British casualties on the first day alone. 19,240 killed, the rest wounded, the single worst day in British military history. And for those horrific casualties, the British had gained perhaps a mile of utterly devastated territory at the deepest penetration. Clearly something had to change, or the war would continue indefinitely with casualties mounting into the millions while the front lines barely moved. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton of the Royal Engineers and William Tritton of Foster and Company designed a solution, an armoured vehicle that could cross trenches up to 8 feet wide, crush barbed wire, protect infantry from machine gun fire, and carry its own weapons to suppress German positions. The first prototype, whimsically named Little Willie, was tested in September 1915. It performed adequately on flat ground but couldn't cross trenches of the width typical on the Western Front. The improved design, Mother, had a distinctive rhomboid shape with tracks running around the entire hull that could cross 8-foot trenches and climb obstacles up to 4.5 feet high. Dimensions specifically chosen to exceed typical German trench and parapet dimensions. The British Army, impressed by trials and desperate for any solution to trench warfare's stalemate, ordered 100 tanks in February 1916 and committed them to combat action in September despite having no established doctrine for their use. Minimal crew training, serious mechanical reliability problems that should have required months more development, and inadequate numbers for a truly decisive impact. The desperation of the Somme offensive, where casualties were mounting at unsustainable rates for minimal gains, overrode all caution and proper preparation. The attack at Flers-Courcelette was planned as a demonstration of the tank's revolutionary potential. 49 Mark I tanks would lead infantry across no man's land at dawn, break through German defensive lines that had resisted months of attacks, and enable a cavalry breakthrough into open country behind German trenches. The same cavalry breakthrough the British had been attempting unsuccessfully for 2 years, with cavalry divisions held in reserve for an opportunity that never materialized. The results were mixed at best, though initial reports emphasized successes while downplaying failures. German defenders were initially terrified. Some fled at the mere sight of the approaching steel monsters, spreading panic through their units. German soldiers who stood their ground and fired rifles and machine guns at the tanks found their bullets completely ineffective against the armor plate, but the tanks were painfully slow. Maximum speed 3.7 miles per hour on good ground, often 1 to 2 miles per hour in rough terrain. Mechanically unreliable with engines and transmissions that frequently failed, highly vulnerable to direct hits from artillery, and operated in near-complete isolation from each other, due to lack of radios and extremely poor visibility from inside the vehicles. Tank D1, commanded by Captain H.W. Mortimer, did achieve a notable success that became the centerpiece of British propaganda about the new weapon. It advanced down the main street of Flers village with infantry following in relative safety, covering 3,500 yards, an extraordinary distance by Somme standards where gains were typically measured in hundreds of yards, and helping capture the entire village. A British reconnaissance aircraft reported back to headquarters, "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind." This single dramatic achievement, widely reported in newspapers, became the image of tank warfare's debut. But the broader tactical picture told a different story, one that was largely suppressed or ignored. The tanks that didn't suffer mechanical breakdowns were either stuck in shell craters and ditches. The Mark I's ground pressure was high enough that soft ground could immobilize it, or were hit by German artillery and destroyed or disabled. Infantry following close behind, tanks found that when tanks drew concentrated fire, being near them was considerably more dangerous than advancing using traditional infiltration tactics. Coordination between tanks and infantry was poor to non-existent. Tanks moved at their own pace, infantry couldn't keep up or got too far ahead, and there was no way to communicate between tank crews sealed inside their steel boxes and infantry outside. By day's end, the British had advanced approximately 2,500 yards at most points along the attack frontage, significant by the miserable standards of the Somme offensive, but hardly the breakthrough victory that tank advocates had promised. The Germans, once the initial shock wore off, found that coordinated artillery fire could destroy tanks, that the tanks were too few and too slow to exploit any breakthrough, and that British infantry following tanks could be engaged effectively once the tanks passed by or were disabled. The British response to this mixed result would determine the future course of armoured warfare for the next quarter century, and they got it catastrophically, tragically wrong in ways that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. British military leadership, analysing the Flers-Courcelette engagement, concluded that tanks were useful infantry support weapons but not capable of independent operations or achieving breakthroughs on their own. They should be parcelled out to infantry divisions in small groups to help them cross trenches and destroy machine gun nests during attacks on prepared positions. They should advance at walking pace alongside infantry, no faster since infantry couldn't run across no man's land anyway. They should be heavily armoured to survive the journey across no man's land, but they didn't need to be particularly fast since speed served no purpose when tied to walking pace infantry attacks. This doctrine, tanks as infantry support weapons, operating in small groups subordinate to infantry commanders, would dominate British military thinking for the next 25 years. It seemed entirely logical based on their World War I experience. Every assumption seemed justified by the evidence they'd observed. It was completely, fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. A small group of visionary British officers, JFC Fuller, B.H. Liddell Hart, Percy Hobart and others, argued passionately for a radically different approach based on deeper analysis of the tank's potential. Tanks should be concentrated in large formations of hundreds of vehicles, not scattered in packets of 10. They should operate independently from infantry, exploiting breakthrough opportunities rather than creating breakthroughs. They should move as fast as mechanically possible to disrupt enemy rear areas, destroy supply lines, and paralyze command and control before defenses could form. They needed to be coordinated with motorized infantry and artillery in combined arms formations, not tied to foot-mobile infantry advancing at 4 miles per hour. These officers wrote extensively. Fuller published multiple books and articles. Liddell Hart became a prolific military theorist and journalist. Hobart designed and conducted training exercises, demonstrating concentration and mobile tactics. Their work was published, widely distributed, and read carefully by military professionals around the world, especially in Germany. The British Army establishment largely ignored them. Fuller's visionary Plan 1919, which envisioned massed tank formations, striking deep into German rear areas to paralyze command structures and logistics networks, was developed in detail but never implemented, because the war ended in November 1918 with Germany's surrender, before the plan could be executed. Post-war budget cuts, driven by war-to-end-all-wars sentiment and economic pressures, meant the British Army couldn't afford to maintain large tank forces anyway. Tanks were expensive, maintenance-intensive, and with the war over, seemed less urgent than other priorities. More fundamentally, the generals who'd commanded in World War I and now led the peacetime army had learned warfare in the trenches. Their formative experiences were infantry assaults, artillery barrages, and incremental territorial gains measured in yards. They couldn't imagine, or refused to imagine, tanks operating independently without infantry support, racing deep into enemy territory, or achieving the kind of rapid, decisive victories Fuller and others described. It seemed like fantasy, like wishful thinking that ignored the grim realities of modern warfare they'd experienced firsthand. By the mid-1930s, as rearmament began in response to rising German military power, Britain had managed to achieve the worst of both worlds. They'd pioneered tank development and had some of the world's best tank designs, but they'd scattered their tanks across infantry divisions in small packets of 10-15 vehicles. They'd developed excellent specific tanks. The Matilda II had armor. No German tank could penetrate in 1940. The Crusader was reasonably fast. The Valentine was reliable, but they used them in ways that systematically negated their advantages. They'd quite literally written the book on armored warfare theory that was being read worldwide, but they'd failed to implement any of their own theories in their actual military organization and doctrine. The Germans, meanwhile, were paying extremely close attention to British developments and British military writing. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbade Germany from possessing tanks, heavy artillery, military aircraft, or an army exceeding 100,000 men. The treaty was designed to permanently eliminate Germany as a military threat. Instead, it inadvertently gave Germany a clean slate to completely rethink military doctrine without the institutional resistance that plagued the victorious powers. German officers, forbidden from actually commanding tank units, instead studied British and French tank operations exhaustively, analyzing after-action reports, reading technical specifications, and most importantly, reading Fuller and Liddell Hart's theoretical writings on armored warfare. They studied these works more carefully and systematically than the British General Staff did, treating them as the foundation for a new way of warfare rather than as interesting but impractical theories. Hinz Guderian, a signals officer in the 1920s with no prior connection to armored warfare, became completely obsessed with Fuller's and Liddell Hart's writings after being assigned to study motorization of the German army. He translated their works into German, studied their theories intensively, corresponded with some of them, and developed his own vision, synthesizing and extending their ideas. Tanks concentrated in entire panzer divisions of 150 mighty 300 vehicles, closely supported by motorized infantry and self-propelled artillery, all coordinated by radio communication, striking fast and deep to paralyze enemy command structures and break enemy will before they could organize coherent defensive responses. This wasn't just about tactics, it was a completely different philosophy of warfare. Instead of wearing down the enemy through attrition, the World War I model, panzer divisions would paralyze the enemy through disruption, moving so fast that enemy commanders would lose track of the situation, cutting communications so orders couldn't be transmitted, destroying supply dumps so forward units ran out of ammunition and fuel, creating panic and chaos that made organized resistance impossible. When Germany began secretly rearming in violation of Versailles in the early 1930s, and then openly rearming after 1935 when the treaty restrictions were abandoned, Guderian finally had his opportunity to test these theories in practice. The first panzer divisions were formed in 1935, combining tanks, motorized infantry, motorized artillery, engineers and reconnaissance units in balanced formations designed for independent operations. They exercised extensively in peacetime maneuvers, developed and refined tactics, and worked out the complex coordination challenges between tanks, infantry, artillery, and close air support. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Wehrmacht had 6 panzer divisions plus 4 light divisions with significant armor components, totaling about 2,500 tanks. The tanks themselves were not particularly impressive from a technical standpoint. The Panzer I was essentially a training vehicle, armed only with machine guns, barely adequate for actual combat. The Panzer II was only slightly better with a 20 mm cannon. Even the Panzer III and IV, the main combat tanks intended to form the backbone of panzer divisions, were inferior to contemporary British and French designs in both armor protection and firepower. German tanks in 1939 to 1940 were objectively worse than their opponents' tanks in almost every measurable technical specification. The Matilda T's armor was 78 mm thick. German tank guns couldn't penetrate it from any angle at combat ranges. The French Chart B1 had 60 mm of armor and a 75 mm gun. It could destroy any German tank while being essentially invulnerable to return fire. British and French tanks were generally better protected, better armed and more heavily built than German panzers. But the Germans had learned the right lessons from World War I and from studying British armored warfare theory. They understood that concentration of force mattered more than absolute numbers, that speed of movement mattered more than thickness of armor, that coordination between different arms mattered more than individual weapons quality, and that disrupting enemy command and control mattered more than destroying enemy forces in direct combat. They'd taken British and French theories that the British and French themselves had abandoned or never properly implemented, developed those theories to operational perfection, and were about to demonstrate them in combat with devastating effectiveness. The test of German armored doctrine came in 2 stages. Poland in September 1939 provided initial proof of concept. German forces conquered Poland in 27 days using coordinated panzer thrusts that encircled and destroyed Polish armies before they could establish coherent defensive lines. But Poland's military was smaller and less well equipped than Western European powers, so skeptics could dismiss German success as victory over an inferior opponent. The real test came in May 1940 when Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. This was the decisive test of armored doctrine. Germany versus the world's largest army, France plus the British Expeditionary Force fighting on terrain the French had spent 20 years preparing to defend, with Germany attacking across the most heavily fortified border in Europe. Germany committed 141 divisions, including 10 panzer divisions and 4 motorized divisions, to the offensive. France had 117 divisions plus 13 British divisions, along with Belgian and Dutch forces, numerical parity in manpower. More importantly, for testing armored doctrine, France and Britain together had approximately 3,000 French and 300 British tanks versus 2,500 German tanks. The Allies had more tanks, and the Allied tanks were generally superior in armor and armament. On paper, considering the defensive advantages of fortifications, prepared positions, and shorter supply lines, the Allies should have been able to defeat the German offensive, or at minimum force a stalemate similar to World War I. In practice, they were catastrophically defeated in 6 weeks in one of military history's most stunning campaigns. The German operational plan concentrated 7 of their 10 panzer divisions in a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French General Staff had dismissed as impassable for large armored formations and therefore left thinly defended. The panzers emerged at the Meuse River, broke through poorly prepared French defensive positions manned by second-rate reserve divisions, and then executed Guderian's vision perfectly. Instead of consolidating and waiting for infantry to catch up traditional military practice, the panzer divisions simply raced west toward the English Channel at maximum speed. The panzer advance achieved 60 miles per day, orders of magnitude faster than any World War I offensive had ever managed. Within 10 days of crossing the Meuse, German armour had reached the Channel coast, cutting off the entire British Expeditionary Force and France's best-equipped armies in Belgium. The Allied forces in Belgium found themselves in a massive pocket, surrounded, cut off from supply, and facing systematic destruction. British and French tanks fought bravely and often effectively in individual engagements, but their employment was doctrinally bankrupt. British Matilda II tanks counterattacked at Arras on May 21st, temporarily creating panic among German commanders including Erwin Rommel, whose 7th Panzer Division was hit by the British attack. The Matilda's heavy armour meant German tank guns couldn't penetrate them. German tanks that engaged British Matildas found themselves completely outmatched. But the British committed only 58 Matilda TIEs, supported by 16 lighter Mark VI tanks, a single battalion-sized force when they needed a corps-sized counterattack with multiple divisions. The attack was isolated, unsupported by infantry or artillery, and ultimately contained by German anti-tank guns. The 88 mm flak gun proved effective when used in ground combat role and Luftwaffe dive bombers. A properly coordinated counterattack with the hundreds of tanks the British had available, supported by infantry and artillery, might have cut the German advance at its most vulnerable point. Instead, the British threw away their qualitative advantage through poor coordination and inadequate commitment of forces. French armour employment was even worse from a doctrinal perspective. French tanks were scattered across the entire front in small packets attached to individual infantry divisions, exactly as British doctrine prescribed but amplified. When powerful French Chars-Bier 1 tanks encountered German panzers in combat, they almost always won the immediate engagement. German tank guns simply couldn't penetrate Chars-Bier 1 frontal armour, while the Bier 1's 75 mm gun could destroy any German tank with a single hit. But isolated French tank companies, no matter how powerful their individual tanks, couldn't stop entire German panzer divisions operating as coordinated combined arms formations. A company of 15 Chars-Bier 1 tanks might destroy a dozen German tanks in an engagement, but the German division would bypass them, continue advancing, and the French company would find itself isolated, out of fuel and ammunition, eventually forced to surrender despite never being defeated in direct combat. The contrast in doctrine was absolutely stark and revealed the fundamental difference in how the two sides understood armored warfare. The Allies used tanks to support infantry attacks against fixed defensive positions, exactly the lesson they'd learned from World War I. The Germans used tanks as independent exploitation forces to disrupt rear areas, destroy supply lines, paralyze enemy command structures, and create chaos before enemy forces could organize coherent resistance. Exactly what Fuller and Liddell Hart had advocated. The Allies concentrated their best tanks and most prepared forces in fortified positions along expected German attack routes, waiting to repel German attacks through superior firepower and defensive positions. The Germans concentrated their tanks at a chosen breakthrough point the French had considered unlikely, smashed through the weak point using concentrated force, and then didn't stop advancing until they reached the Channel coast 200 miles away, ignoring their flanks and supply lines in pursuit of operational paralysis of the enemy. By June 4, 1940, the British had evacuated 338,000 troops from Dunkirk in a desperate evacuation under German air attack, abandoning essentially all their heavy equipment, including 880 tanks, 310 artillery pieces, 2,400 machine guns, 76,000 tons of ammunition, and 164,000 tons of fuel and supplies. The evacuation itself was a remarkable achievement of improvised organization. but it represented a catastrophic military defeat, an entire army forced to abandon its equipment and flee across the Channel. By June 22, 1940, France had surrendered. The Third Republic that had survived 4 years of World War I collapsed after 6 weeks. The campaign cost Germany approximately 27,000 killed, 111,000 wounded, and 18,000 missing, serious casualties, but far lighter than World War I battles. France lost approximately 85,000 killed, 120,000 wounded, plus 1.9 million prisoners, effectively the entire French army eliminated as a fighting force. The British lost 68,000 casualties in the campaign. The speed, scale, and completeness of the victory shocked everyone, including the Germans themselves. Many German generals had been skeptical of the Ardennes plan, considering it too risky. Hitler himself had been nervous about advancing so deep into Allied territory with exposed flanks. Guderian's panzer tactics, developed from British theories that the British themselves had rejected and never implemented, had achieved in 6 weeks what Germany had failed to achieve in 4 years of World War I. The British response was predictable but wrong. They blamed their tanks rather than their doctrine. Clearly British tanks were inferior to German panzers, the analysis concluded. British tanks needed to be bigger with more armor and bigger guns. They needed to design specialized tanks for different roles. Infantry tanks, thick armor, slow speed, designed to support infantry attacks, and cruiser tanks, faster, lighter armor, designed for exploitation once infantry created breakthrough. They needed more tanks overall, produced in greater quantities. What they never seriously questioned was the fundamental doctrine. Tanks remained scattered across infantry divisions rather than concentrated in armored divisions. The few armored divisions Britain did eventually form remained poorly coordinated, inadequately trained in mobile operations, and doctrinally confused about their actual purpose. British tank designs became increasingly specialized and increasingly divorced from what actually made tanks effective in combat: mobility, concentration, and combined arms coordination. The pattern repeated itself with depressing consistency in North Africa from 1940 to 1942. British forces in Egypt faced German and Italian forces in Libya in a campaign that swung back and forth across the desert like a pendulum for 2 years. Rommel's Afrika Korps, never numbering more than 3 divisions and chronically short of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and reinforcements, repeatedly defeated larger British forces despite British numerical superiority in tanks, troops, and supplies. The problem wasn't British courage. British soldiers and tank crews fought with tremendous bravery throughout the North African campaign. The problem wasn't British equipment. By 1942, British tanks like the Grant and Sherman American supplied were roughly equivalent to German tanks, and British numerical superiority meant they had more of them. The problem was doctrine. British commanders in North Africa repeatedly charged German positions with tank formations unsupported by infantry or artillery, treating tanks as cavalry that could win battles through shock and speed alone. They positioned tanks in static defensive positions where German anti-tank guns could engage them at leisure from concealed positions. They failed to coordinate tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into effective combined arms teams. They violated essentially every principle of proper armored warfare that their own theorists had written about 20 years earlier. Rommel, meanwhile, demonstrated proper combined arms doctrine repeatedly. He used concentrated armor to maneuver British forces into positions where German anti-tank guns, particularly the deadly 88mm guns, could engage British tanks at ranges where British return fire was ineffective. He coordinated tanks, anti-tank guns, artillery, and close air support into mutually supporting combined arms teams where each element protected and enhanced the others. He understood that tanks' primary asset was mobility, and that proper support from other arms maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their vulnerabilities. Rommel's tactical and operational skill was certainly a factor in German success, but the more fundamental issue was that he understood how to employ armor properly while British commanders didn't. German forces consistently achieved better results with fewer tanks because they used them correctly, while British forces squandered their numerical advantages through poor employment. The British kept blaming their tanks rather than examining their doctrine. The Crusader tank was too mechanically unreliable, its engines failed too often. The Valentine was too slow to keep up with more mobile German forces. The Churchill had good armor but was undergunned and couldn't compete with German tanks in firepower. British tank design became increasingly desperate, constantly seeking the perfect combination of armor, speed, and firepower without addressing the doctrinal problems that were the actual source of their defeats. The truth, revealed through German military documents captured after the war and through post-war interrogations of German commanders, was that German officers were consistently surprised and puzzled by British tactical incompetence. German after-action reports from North Africa repeatedly expressed bewilderment that British numerical superiority in tanks should have been decisive, but British employment was so consistently poor that German forces could defeat them despite being substantially outnumbered. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, who commanded German armored forces in North Africa before being captured in 1942, wrote in a report in August 1942, "The British have excellent tanks and exceptionally brave crews willing to press attacks with great determination. But they use their armor abominably. They charge our defensive positions without adequate reconnaissance, without coordinated infantry support, without artillery preparation. They repeat the same tactical mistakes in battle after battle. If they ever develop proper combined arms doctrine and learn to use their numerical superiority effectively, we're finished. But based on 2 years of combat against them, I don't believe they're capable of learning these lessons." His assessment was harsh but largely accurate. It would take until late 1942, with Montgomery's assumption of command before the Second Battle of El Alamein, for British forces to develop truly effective combined arms coordination. And even then, Montgomery's approach was methodical, cautious, and attritional, emphasizing overwhelming material superiority and careful preparation, rather than the mobile aggressive armored warfare that Guderian had pioneered. The Americans, entering ground combat in North Africa in late 1942, initially adopted British doctrine and equipment and suffered predictably similar defeats. American tank forces at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 were badly mauled by more experienced German units employing proper combined arms tactics. American tanks were sent forward unsupported, were ambushed by German anti-tank guns in prepared positions, and suffered heavy casualties while achieving little. But the Americans proved more capable of rapid institutional learning than the British. Partly this was because American forces had less institutional attachment to failed World War I doctrines they'd barely fought in that war compared to Britain's total commitment. Partly it was American pragmatism and willingness to discard methods that didn't work. And partly it was simply that American industrial superiority meant they could afford to learn through expensive trial and error, replacing losses faster than they accumulated them. By mid-1943, American armored doctrine had evolved substantially. American tank battalions operated as part of combined arms task forces that integrated tanks, infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, specialized anti-tank vehicles, engineers, and air support. American artillery was highly centralized and extraordinarily responsive. Forward observers could call for fire missions that would be answered by dozens of guns within minutes. American air support, once proper air-ground coordination was developed, was overwhelming. American logistics provided the supplies that kept mobile operations sustainable. The result was an effective if methodical approach to armored warfare. American forces didn't achieve the spectacular operational successes of German panzer operations at their peak, but they ground forward steadily, concentrating overwhelming force at chosen points, coordinating all arms effectively, and accepting that slow, certain progress was preferable to risky gambles. The British, meanwhile, never fully abandoned their flawed tankers infantry support doctrine even as late as 1944–45. British armoured divisions in the Normandy campaign were more effective than they'd been in 1940 or early North Africa. They'd learned some lessons through bitter experience, but they remained doctrinally conservative, uncomfortable with deep independent operations, and prone to methodical advances that German forces could predict and counter. Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in September 1944 exemplified persistent British problems with armoured operations. The plan called for British XX Corps, led by armoured divisions, to advance 60 miles up a single road through German-held Netherlands to relieve British and American airborne forces that would capture bridges along the route. The armour would advance rapidly, pushing through any resistance to achieve link-up within 48 hours. The operation failed catastrophically for multiple reasons, but armoured employment was certainly one of them. British tanks advancing along a single narrow road without ability to maneuver around resistance, without adequate infantry support to clear flanking German positions, unable to deploy off-road due to soft ground and canals, provided perfect targets for German anti-tank guns. The advance stalled repeatedly when leading tanks were destroyed, blocking the single road for hours while wreckage was cleared. The armor that did advance found itself unable to effectively suppress German positions on the flanks. A properly executed armored operation would have advanced on a broad front, with multiple routes allowing maneuver around resistance, with adequate infantry clearing flanking positions, with engineering support to create additional crossing points. Instead, British armor was funneled down a single predictable route where German forces could concentrate defensive fires, exactly the kind of employment that Fuller and Liddell Hart had warned against 25 years earlier. The supreme historical irony was fully visible by 1945. British armoured divisions rolling through Germany in the final campaigns were finally operating in concentrated formations using mobile warfare doctrine, the same doctrine Fuller and Liddell Hart had advocated a quarter-century earlier, the same doctrine Germans had adopted and used to conquer most of Europe. The British had invented armoured warfare, rejected their own invention, been defeated by enemies who learned from them, and finally relearned their own lessons after 6 years of war and hundreds of thousands of casualties. Post-war analysis revealed the full scale of the institutional failure. British tank production during World War II totaled approximately 25,000 tanks of various types. German production was approximately 49,000 tanks. Soviet production was roughly 105,000 tanks, more than everyone else combined. American production was approximately 88,000 tanks, most produced in 1943 to 45 once American industry fully mobilized. But production numbers weren't the deciding factor in armored warfare effectiveness. The Soviets, despite producing more tanks than everyone else combined, suffered catastrophic defeats in 1941 to 42, when they scattered their enormous armor forces across thousands of miles of front in small, poorly coordinated packets. They learned, painfully and at enormous cost, to concentrate armor in tank armies and tank corps, adopted operational doctrines often learned from captured German documents and interrogated German prisoners, and by 1943 to 44 were executing operational maneuvers that Guderian would have recognized as refined and improved versions of his own theories. The British and French had more tanks and objectively better tanks than Germany in May 1940, yet lost decisively in 6 weeks. The Soviets had vastly more tanks in June 1941 and still nearly lost to Germany because their armor was scattered and poorly employed. Numbers alone didn't determine outcomes. Doctrine, how you used the tanks you had, was what mattered. The side that concentrated tanks in large formations operated them independently to exploit opportunities, coordinated them effectively with other arms, and understood that mobility and disruption were more valuable than direct combat superiority. That side won consistently regardless of having fewer or technically inferior tanks. The side that scattered tanks in small packets, tied them to slow-moving infantry, failed to coordinate combined arms and used them as mobile pillboxes rather than exploitation forces. That side lost consistently despite often having numerical and technical superiority. J.F.C. Fuller, the British officer who'd written extensively and prophetically about armoured warfare theory in the 1920s, who'd watched his ideas be systematically rejected by the British Army and enthusiastically adopted by the Germans, wrote bitterly in his 1945 book Armoured Warfare, "We British invented the tank. We developed the complete theory of armoured warfare. We wrote the books that Guderian Reed studied and the Germans implemented. Then we systematically ignored our own work, scattered our tanks uselessly across the battlefield in penny packets, and were comprehensively defeated by our own ideas in enemy hands." Military history offers few examples of such comprehensive, self-inflicted institutional failure. D.H. Liddell Hart, another pioneering British armoured warfare theorist, whose books were studied carefully in Germany while being largely ignored by British commanders, was more measured in his criticism, but equally damning in his assessment. The tank was fundamentally a British invention that we proceeded to use in precisely the wrong way for 20 years, ignoring the lessons of our own experience in 1918 and the recommendations of our own military theorists. The Germans, forbidden by treaty from possessing tanks and forced to start from theoretical foundations, studied our operations more carefully and analytically than we studied them ourselves, learned the correct lessons while we learned incorrect ones, and applied those lessons with devastating effectiveness. We spent 2 decades conclusively proving that the side with superior doctrine defeats the side with superior equipment. The Germans themselves, with the detachment of defeat and post-war analysis, acknowledged the profound irony. Jens Guderian, in his 1951 memoir Panzer Leader, wrote with evident respect for the British theorists who'd inspired him, "I owe the inspiration for my conception of armoured warfare primarily to Captain Liddell Hart and General Fuller, whose theoretical works on the subject I studied intensely in the 1920s when I was developing my own ideas. Their works fundamentally shaped my understanding of how armour should be employed, concentrated in large formations, operating independently, striking deep to paralyze rather than destroy, coordinating with air power and motorized support." It remains one of history's profound ironies that British theorists developed the ideas that Germany used to defeat Britain in 1940. Had the British Army implemented the doctrines their own theorists advocated so persuasively, the campaign in France might have had a dramatically different outcome. I have no doubt that British and French armour, properly concentrated and employed according to Fuller's and Liddell Hart's theories, could have defeated our panzer divisions. Their tanks were generally superior to ours in 1940. But doctrine matters more than equipment, and their doctrine was fundamentally flawed while ours, learned from their theorists, was sound. The costs of Britain's doctrinal failure, measured in lives lost and strategic consequences, were immense and tragic. The British Army in France in 1940 lost 68,000 casualties and was forced to abandon 880 tanks, 310 guns, and essentially all its heavy equipment in 6 weeks of fighting. North African campaigns from 1940 to 1942 saw British forces repeatedly outfought by smaller German forces, with British tank losses in those campaigns exceeding 3,000 vehicles, most lost when British formations were outmaneuvered and surrounded, rather than destroyed in direct combat. But the costs extended far beyond British casualties. French military doctrine in 1940 was similarly flawed. Armour tied rigidly to infantry, defensive mentality, slow response to German breakthrough operations, failure to concentrate forces effectively. The result was France's catastrophic defeat, 4 years of brutal German occupation, approximately 550,000 French military and civilian dead, and damage to French society, economy, and national psyche that took generations to heal. The broader strategic consequences of the 1940 defeat were immense and shaped the entire course of the war. Germany's victory freed them to turn their full attention east toward the Soviet Union in 1941. The Holocaust became possible because Germany controlled most of Europe. The war extended to 1945 instead of potentially ending in 1940 if the Allies had defeated the German offensive. Tens of millions died in a war that might have been prevented or dramatically shortened if Britain and France had properly understood and implemented their own armoured warfare theories. All because the British invented a revolutionary weapon, developed sophisticated theories for its revolutionary employment, then systematically rejected those theories and inadvertently taught their future enemies how to use the weapon properly against them. The institutional conservatism, resistance to innovation, and preference for comfortable established doctrine over uncomfortable new ideas cost the world dearly. The lesson transcends tanks specifically, which became largely obsolete in modern warfare with the development of precision-guided anti-tank missiles, attack helicopters, and long-range precision fires. The fundamental lesson is about institutional learning, innovation, and the deadly dangers of rejecting revolutionary capabilities in favor of comfortable incremental improvements to established methods. Military institutions are inherently and necessarily conservative. They cannot adopt every new idea or pursue every proposed innovation without becoming chaotic and ineffective. But there's a crucial difference between healthy institutional conservatism that carefully evaluates innovations and institutional blindness that rejects innovations because they challenge comfortable assumptions and threaten established hierarchies. The British Army in the 1920s to 30s had officers advocating genuinely revolutionary doctrines based on new technology and careful analysis of World War I experience. They had talented theorists writing books, designing exercises, and demonstrating concepts. They had evidence from World War I showing conclusively that existing infantry artillery methods had failed catastrophically, producing millions of casualties for minimal territorial gains. But the institution rejected innovation because it threatened officers whose expertise and careers were built on traditional infantry warfare, because it required expensive reorganization and retraining, and because it challenged comfortable assumptions about how wars were fought and won. The Germans, starting from the catastrophic defeat of 1918 and bound by treaty restrictions that forced them to completely rethink military organization, had no institutional resistance to radical new ideas. They could adopt revolutionary doctrines precisely because they had nothing invested in existing methods and everything to gain from finding new approaches. They read British and French theorists more carefully than those theorists' own armies did, not because Germans were inherently more innovative, but because defeat and restriction made them desperate for any advantage they could find. The result was that the defeated, restricted power of 1918 became the temporarily victorious power of 1940, using weapons and theories that the victorious powers had invented and carelessly discarded. The side that learned from defeat prevailed over the side that learned nothing from victory, and the weapon that was supposed to break the stalemate of trench warfare ended up enabling a new form of mobile warfare that neither its inventors nor its initial victims properly understood until too late. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, one of the original tank inventors who'd first proposed the concept in 1914, lived through the disasters of 1940 and died in 1951, having watched his invention be used brilliantly by Germany and incompetently by Britain for over 2 decades. In one of his final interviews in 1946, looking back across 30 years, he reflected with evident pain, "We built the first tanks because trench warfare had become not just costly but literally impossible. We were killing hundreds of thousands of men for advances measured in yards. We used tanks too early at the Somme in 1916 before they were truly reliable because we were so desperate for anything that might break the stalemate." But even in those first crude engagements, some of us could see the revolutionary potential. Not as just another infantry support weapon to help cross trenches, but as an entirely independent force that could restore mobility and decisiveness to warfare. The tragedy that still keeps me awake at night is that we had brilliant officers who understood this potential completely. Fuller wrote about it with prophetic clarity. Liddell Hart developed the theories in extraordinary detail. Hobart designed training exercises that demonstrated the concepts practically. But the army rejected them, dismissed them, sidelined them. Their ideas threatened too many established careers, challenged too many comfortable assumptions, required too much change to comfortable established practice. So the Germans read Fuller and Liddell Hart and Hobart more carefully and respectfully than our own general staff ever did. They tested the theories we rejected. They built the organizations we refused to build. They developed the doctrines we dismissed as impractical fantasy. And in 1940 they defeated us comprehensively using our own ideas, our own theories, our own revolutionary concepts that we'd invented and then carelessly thrown away. I suppose there's a certain justice in it, though it's cold comfort to the men who died because of our institutional blindness. We invented the weapon but couldn't imagine how to use it properly. The Germans, to their credit, could imagine it. They learned from our success at inventing it and from our failure at employing it. We only learned from our failures, and by then it was far too late to matter. Military institutions must be conservative by nature. You cannot change fundamental doctrine every few years based on untested theories or fashionable ideas. But there's an enormous difference between healthy, careful conservatism and blind, stubborn resistance to obvious innovation. We were blind to our own innovations and deaf to our own theorists. We paid for that blindness with defeat, with dead soldiers, with years of additional war that might have been avoided. Perhaps future military establishments will learn from our example, though I'm pessimistic about that possibility. Every generation of military leaders seems to believe their experience is universal and timeless, that the way they learn to fight is the way wars will always be fought. The next revolutionary technology, whatever it is, will probably be mishandled just as thoroughly as we mishandled the tank, and for exactly the same reasons. His pessimism was tragically justified by subsequent history. The pattern of inventing revolutionary capabilities and then failing to understand their revolutionary implications repeated throughout the 20th century. The British invented radar in the 1930s but nearly failed to integrate it properly into comprehensive air defense systems until desperate necessity forced rapid adaptation in 1940. The Americans invented the aircraft carrier and naval aviation but nearly lost the Pacific to Japan's more developed and aggressive carrier warfare doctrine. The Soviets developed deep battle doctrine in the early 1930s, then abandoned it during Stalin's purges and had to painfully relearn it after catastrophic defeats in 1941. The pattern repeats because institutional conservatism and resistance to threatening innovation are built deeply into military organizations. Innovation is genuinely risky. New doctrines require expensive changes to training, organization, equipment, and command structures. Officers who've built successful careers on established methods naturally resist changes that make their hard-won expertise obsolete. And peacetime military establishments, without the urgent pressure of combat defeats forcing adaptation, can maintain comfortable but failed doctrines indefinitely. The tank story specifically teaches several enduring lessons that remain relevant even as tanks themselves become less dominant in modern warfare. First, having the best equipment is worthless if your doctrine for employing that equipment is fundamentally flawed. Second, inventing a revolutionary capability means nothing if you cannot imagine and implement revolutionary applications. Third, reading history and learning from it matters infinitely more than writing history and then ignoring it. Fourth, sometimes being defeated teaches more than being victorious if you're intellectually honest enough to learn from defeat rather than making excuses. The Germans learned from comprehensive defeat in 1918 and won decisively in 1940. The British won in 1918 and lost in 1940, because victory made them complacent while defeat made the Germans desperate to understand what went wrong. The nation that learned the right lessons from failure prevailed over the nation that learned nothing from success. And the weapon that was supposed to end the stalemate of trench warfare ultimately enabled a new form of mobile warfare that neither its inventors nor its victims initially understood. September 15, 1916, at Flussers-Courcelette, when Captain Mortimer drove Tank D1 down the high street with British infantry cheering behind him, genuinely looked like the future of warfare. It absolutely was the future, but not in the way Britain imagined or hoped. The future of armored warfare belonged to whoever could understand and implement it most effectively, not to whoever invented the technology first. Britain invented it. Germany mastered it. And by the time Britain finally, painfully relearned its own lessons about its own invention, 6 years of war had killed tens of millions and permanently reshaped the entire world. The tank crawling through the morning mist at the Somme in 1916 was carrying far more than 8 British soldiers sealed in a steel box. It was carrying the seeds of future victories and devastating future defeats, future innovations and catastrophic future failures, brilliant theories and their tragic rejection. And the lesson it ultimately taught, that invention without proper understanding, innovation without implementation, and brilliant theory, without practical application are certain paths to defeat, remains as relevant today as military technology continues its relentless evolution, and military institutions continue struggling to adapt to changes that threaten comfortable established practice.